Hi everyone, welcome to our latest edition of ELI on Air, the regular ELI Talks interactive broadcast where we talk with interesting folks from across the Jewish spectrum about ideas of Jewish engagement, literacy, and identity. And I am really thrilled to be here today with Mamie Kanfer Stewart and with David Homan. We'll be discussing Mamie's lovely and powerful ELI talk, Teaching an Organization to Fish, and some of the implications that she brings up in that particular piece. And if anyone would like to submit questions, again, this entire broadcast is interactive, and we're happy to hear from you. There is a Q&A app that you can open through the video itself. Just sign into your Google account and open up. There should be a little black box with some yellow writing in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Clicking on that will open up the Q&A app. We'll be able to submit your ideas and we'll address there. And if you'd like to share any ideas over Twitter, using the hashtag ELITalks, ELI, and we'll take your questions from there. And I would like to start off with Mamie. For those who may not have gotten a chance to see her talk in advance of this conversation, Mamie, do you mind giving a quick overview of some of the ideas that you presented?
Absolutely. So hello and welcome everyone. Just before I get into my talk, I wanted to just quickly say that my day job is as the founder and CEO of Starling, and we make online team collaboration tools, and we hope you'll all check it out. But I'm here today speaking wearing my funder hat. I've been a board member of both of my family foundations for a number of years and have been involved in philanthropy for almost a decade. And I gave an ELI talk about a topic that is very important to me, how we as funders engage with nonprofit professionals. So if you haven't seen it yet, I hope that you'll check out the real video. But for the purpose of today, here is a quick recap. You may be familiar with the saying, you can give a man a fish and feed him for a day, or you can teach a man to fish and feed him for a lifetime. So with the vast majority of our philanthropic dollars today going to organizations instead of to individuals, I was curious, how do we apply this wisdom to our contemporary form of philanthropy? To basically, how do we teach an organization to fish? So I started by going back to Maimonides' original teaching, and what I found was that he was really asking us to do more than just give, but he was asking us to enable people or to enable organizations. And from that, I drew 3 values that we can apply as funders to our work. The first is respect, that we can truly respect and demonstrate that respect to the nonprofit professionals who work hard every day to prepare the world. And we can really treat them as partners and change the power dynamic that we have with them. The second is to develop a relationship of trust. More than just trusting that they're going to spend our dollars wisely, but to build a relationship where they can be honest and share the real challenges and the real critical situations that they're facing. And we can invest in them and we can help them develop their capacity so that they can do more. And lastly is a sense of commitment, that we can make multi-year gifts, that we can share and be in it together with them, with these nonprofits, which will do multiple things. It creates stability. It signals that we believe in them. They can use that to leverage other dollars, but most importantly, they can spend time focusing on bringing new dollars to the cause instead of continually courting us. So that was a very, very, very fast recap. Again, I hope you'll check out the original video. But now I'd like to turn it over to my good friend and someone who I respect very much, David Homan, who is going to join me in this conversation today. David, on to you.
Thank you, Mamie. I apologize to anyone who's hearing our C-class building heat pipes banging, but this is what you get when you're running a nonprofit. I think I wanted to pick up, in particular, Mamie, on your comment that funders really give to organizations more than individuals. Just to say that, in my experience as director of the American Israel Cultural Foundation, almost every funder who engages on an individual relationship with either myself or somebody on our board. So it's a very rare thing for a funder to not engage without some individual relationship. But I think what you mean by engagement is to actually have the hard conversations, what's happening with an organization, where we need to go, and how you fit in. Because fundraising and partnerships with funders is exactly the same thing as relationships in real life. And if you come on too strong, you tell somebody too much of what you need, you really run that risk of alienation. And since most of us in the world of nonprofits are desperate for more funding, it's really a hard balance of how much you open up about what you need and how much you think you're actually going to get from making yourself more vulnerable. And that's where, I would be curious as a funder, is there an example of a nonprofit that you've worked with that has opened up in a way that made you feel more cautious about them? Or has it been the opposite, while by opening up, you actually gained a lot more respect for what they're going through?
It's a tough line for sure. It's a tough balance to find between how much do you share and how much do you project an air of we're under control, we know what we're going on, know what we're doing. And I would say that I don't know that I have an exact story to draw upon to say this was a time when someone really opened up, but what I do know is that from my experience as a board member, that when I am on the inside and I can see what's really happening and understand the bigger picture and the context of the work, it doesn't have to be this dance anymore, because there's automatically a sense of respect and buy-in from me as a funder because I now have a stake in the success of this organization. So I think if more funders saw themselves as not just donors, but really having a stake in an organization the same way that an investor in a company has a stake in that company, that they might reframe the way that they think about knowing the real facts on the inside. And that as a funder, if you're making an investment, if you're giving a grant to an organization, the best thing for you to do is to know what's going on and to be able to find ways to help that organization succeed with more than just money. So it might be somewhat of a mind shift that just needs to happen.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, what I can tell you from my experience is, I run a nonprofit that's been rated 4 stars for the last several years by Charity Navigator, and it actually hasn't changed our paradigm at all. And the funders that do want to engage with us, I've been asked frequently if I have a strategic plan, but I would say it's a rare thing that somebody actually likes to see it or wants to look through it. So a close friend who just took a big position at the Howard Gilman Foundation told me the other day she was reading through the audit of an organization and called the charity and asked them questions, and they said, "You're the first person that ever has read the audit that we've submitted." So I'm not saying that this puts the burden entirely back on the funder's side, but for organizations to spend the time to prove their worth, there needs to be, I think, a shift where the conversation then goes both ways, so that I know that by engaging in a strategic talk, I'm not undermining my organization, but actually strengthening it by showing what we've done and then being able to say, these are our challenges.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the biggest problems that funders have in general, which is asking for way more than they actually want or need. And this is one of the things I talk about in my talk about the level of respect that we're showing, that we as funders often create hoops for nonprofits to jump through that are really unnecessary.
So what would be, say, your top 2 or 3 requirements of a nonprofit as you engage in this talk? Like, what would you ask either of me or another colleague if you were to start to embark on this? Do you look for financial, strategic plan, an in-depth conversation of what has happened? Do you need vulnerability and weaknesses to show that they're thinking about it? Like, what are the priorities you see that nonprofits and funders looking at nonprofits should look for?
Well, the first thing is that as a funder, I think about where does my gift fit into this organization? Or what's the scale of my donation? Because for some people, making a $5,000 or $10,000 donation is a huge amount, and they see themselves as being a big donor when, for this particular organization, a gift of $10,000 is lovely, and they need it, and they want it, and they want you to be part of the community. But, for them, a big donor is $50,000 or $500,000. And so understanding where you fit into the organization's context and not just how the organization fits into your context is really important. And having that conversation with an organization, having an organization say, thank you so much, but kind of figuring out a way for them to communicate whether or not your gift warrants even having a conversation versus a simple thank you email or a follow-up letter is important, because there have been times where I've made a donation that's $1,000, which to me was not a particularly big deal, and have gotten the most beautiful letter in return, because for this particular organization, that was a huge deal, and I had no idea. And I've had the opposite happen too, where I made a more significant gift and expected much more and didn't get it. So that's kind of the first piece that goes to it.
Okay.
But then when it comes to what you're actually asking about of, what is important to me, what do I look for? I think it's a couple of things. So I'm very aware of organizational life stages, and I know that some organizations are very early and they don't necessarily have a huge track record of long-term success or really being able to prove impact with data. And other organizations are more mature and they have more ground to stand on, as some would say. So I think the first thing for me is to understand what success looks like for this organization and what strengths that they really have. And that could be, a couple of PowerPoint slides, like a strategic plan of this is what we've accomplished and this is where we're going. Maybe a slide on their financials. Who are their major funders? What are their biggest line items in their budget? Where's their cost centers? But I think it really depends on every funder. I think each funder probably wants something different, which is one of the challenges here, is because you can't make everybody happy. Because you don't really know what's motivating them or how they're making their decisions.
I think very well said. I think, what I would add to it is, and I'll just give a few statistics about my organization so we get to some details, and we have 700 funders. Of those 749 are foundations. And of those foundations, 2 give general operating support. Everyone else has a very specific purpose. And so of those 2, those are my most concrete and long-term relationships. One of them is with the Meyerhoff Foundation, where my colleague Rafi Ron and I have an ongoing rapport of this trust. He's a foundation professional who really asks me where the needs are, where their impact would be, and what our role is related to his foundation's mission. So as an example of something where you have a fantastic conversation, over the 6 years of this relationship, it's actually led to more significant funding for our organization, because the conversations we had were not one-offs. As I hopefully predicted the growth of our organization and the strengthening of our priorities, the fact that this foundation was involved brought on other funders and ended up increasing the scope of what they did with us. But this was, as I said, a 6-year process. So what do you do if you're thinking of looking at an organization, big track record or not? How long do you need to see and measure them before you can start to engage in this type of talk? Is it immediate because you like what they do? Or do you need to really understand their board, their CEO or executive director, or just how their programs work? What depth do you need to understand them before you think funders should really start to have this talk?
That's a very tough question to answer. And in some ways, I'd almost turn it around to you of, how much time can you spend and afford to spend on engaging with donors that, may or may not have any desire to give long-term or to engage in these conversations. I think from my experience, I often tend to start just by learning about an organization and might not even give to them for the first year or two, where I'm just trying to understand what it is they do and who their leadership is, and before I even open a conversation with them. And then my plan, like the giving plan my husband and I set out for ourselves, often is kind of the assumption that we're going to grow. We know that if we find organizations that we like, we're going to give them a small gift to begin with, and over time we plan into our budget that we hope that they're going to continue to do great work, and we're going to continue to build relationships, and we're going to want to give them more. But I don't know that that's the case with most funders. It almost starts to feel like if I give to one, that's less money I have to give to someone else. And if I give you too much now, then am I going to have to keep giving that much to you later in the future, even if I decide I don't want to give to you because it's hard or awkward to pull back funding? So I don't know if it's a timing question.
Timing, but also when organizations, as you said in your speech, have to go back every year to the same funders, it takes up our resources to grow the organization. So if you're all for understanding an organization and making a commitment, do you think a 2-year commitment, a 5-year commitment? I understand you make a long-term commitment that ties up what you could do elsewhere, but without giving an organization security, how can a funder really give them the space to grow?
I agree. I think that's part of this challenge, and it is about making a commitment, and part of that is doing better planning as a funder so that you know what your kind of pot is, and making sure that you don't see it as a limited resource, because you can give more than money. So even if your funding stays flat, but you engage in deeper conversation with executive directors, or if you make connections or introductions or other kinds of non-financial gifts, that can kind of be a more expansive way to think about what it is that you as a funder can offer.
So let's talk a little bit about that, the non-financial gifts, because the statistics show that people who give to organizations are now spending more time with them on average than the previous generation who simply gave but weren't active. So there are direct statistics that show the trends. But what's the most important in terms of what a funder can do beyond the money itself?
I think that's a great question for you to answer, because as a funder, I have plenty of skills I can bring, which are going to vary widely based on who the funder is. But I think what's more important is, what is it that a nonprofit professional needs from their funders, because it might not be what I have to offer, and so finding a different way to engage with me might be better than me wasting your time with all of the skills I have that aren't very valuable.
Okay, so I'll answer my own question then.
Good.
So it's a double-edged sword. The first thing, and I'll try to say this delicately, not everyone who has substantial wealth actually knows what an organization needs. But because they have the wealth, my job is to listen, regardless of whether it might be the best direction from my organization, and see if I can find a match. So where there are funders that have experience, do they need to join the board in order to be effective? My answer would be no. Although board membership is important, I would say the single most important thing a funder can do, if they believe that, say, my organization was part of what you and your husband or your family foundation see as your own values, I think most funders work in a peer system. Most funders do not work in isolation. So if we're getting support from a funder that has 11 other groups that fund similar endeavors, and most of them are private, the only way to open up that conversation is for you as a funder to say, I believe in this organization, and I think that you should too. But oftentimes what happens is that then costs you money, where you believe in an organization, you introduce them to 2 people, and then you have to support those people's organizations. So it's a peer game, but it's also another circle where it can cost a funder more money to open up their Rolodex as well.
That is absolutely true, and I will tell you, I really hate raising money. Just to be very honest, I hate asking people for money, even for causes that I love. It's very awkward, and not all funders, just because you have money doesn't mean you want or are good at asking others for money. So there's definitely a lot of complexity around funders networking with other funders.
It's true, but I mean, the one example where you helped me last year, there was a particular person we wanted to join our young leadership that I wasn't able to approach, and in one email, I had a meeting. So there's a lot to be said for welcoming people in, but that's where you have to have the trust in the relationship first. Because majority of funding, especially in the Jewish world, you cannot apply for. You have to be, quote unquote, chosen. So if that's the case, then I think what your argument is, which is more active funders would lead to a better and stronger field. Organizations need to do our homework. We need to have our strategy, our financials. We need to understand the value of our mission and our staff and understand more about what we need beyond keeping the lights on tomorrow. But I'd say on the funder side, that to have those conversations honestly might even be a shift in a lot of where the field funds. because there's a lot of interest, but it's a lot of singular interest. So for what you and your family feel are important with Jewish living, ideally as you take more of a lead with this, other funders should come with you, which means your funding of organizations that embody this brings awareness of them in a way that they can't do on their own.
Absolutely, and that's actually something our foundation takes very seriously, is who are we funding, because that says something about those organizations that we have, as a family foundation, have in some ways vetted them and have relationships with them, and therefore other funders can kind of see that as not a stamp of approval, but as a kind of as a sign that this organization is worth funding. I mean, that's often what happens. And so we want to make sure that as a foundation, we've done our homework because we know that it's helpful to other organizations and other professionals and other funders to see that we've committed to giving this organization funding.
But have you had a situation where a partner funder, a friend, whatever it is, calls you up and says, hey, we see you support this NGO, what do you think of them? We're looking into them. Have you seen that type of interaction between funders?
Yes, and we've done the same with other funders, where we're thinking about funding an organization and we know that someone else has partnered with them, or we know that someone else has been funding them for a long time or recently stopped funding them, and we've asked and we've tried to understand more through that relationship as funder to funder. Absolutely.
Can I pick your brain, since we're live, about both the do's and the don'ts? What are some of the red flags that a funder would look at in an organization and be wary of? Say this conversation starts, but it's not necessarily going the way you want it to. What are the things nonprofits really need to address that, without addressing, would cause real red flags for you and your family?
Let's see. Well, I think one thing is tailoring yourself too much for a funder. And I've seen this happen where it feels, you can kind of see that it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel authentic. It feels like they're trying to make their program or their mission fit into yours as a funder. And I don't think it ever works. So being really thoughtful ahead of time about why you think this funder's passion or what they are interested in really meshes with what it is you as an organization are doing, so that you're starting by approaching the right people, and then secondly, you're coming at it from I would say like a user perspective. So what is this funder? What are they interested in? How do we really fit in that in a meaningful way? Because if you can't make a compelling case, no matter how smart you are and how wonderful you are, if it's a strategic funder, they're not gonna give.
Okay, but let's say for instance, I've made a compelling case, and we're in the middle of a conversation. If we don't necessarily get along, if you don't like the CEO of an organization, does that affect the decision, or is it really about the mission? Because not everyone's going to have a personal relationship between funder and grantee.
So I've only met one executive director who I didn't believe in, to be honest.
Okay.
So it's a little bit hard to say, but I find that really it's not all that different from the business that I'm in, of being a CEO and trying to sell the product that I'm selling in the marketplace. That if I can demonstrate that I'm passionate about what I'm doing, that I understand the field, I understand the complexities and the challenges, and I'm not oblivious or naive to the situation, that personality matters much less. It's more about, do I have faith in this person? Do I believe that they can execute on the plans and this vision that they're setting out? And I would say, the vast majority of times, the answer is yes, that I can see the fire in that person's eyes. And that's really what matters, much less about, do I get along with them? Okay.
So what about immediate impact? I mean, my organization has asked repeatedly, what's your immediate impact? What's your immediate impact? And we fund 12-year-old dancers and 10-year-old musicians. They become Itzhak Perlman and Ohad Naharin, but that takes years. So I can never demonstrate immediate impact for what I do. So how carefully do you or other funders weigh the idea of immediate metrics in order of weighing whether you would get more involved? Not to give, but to get more involved to really put yourself into an organization?
So sadly, I think we're at a very critical time where the world of metrics and big data and measurement are shifting and becoming more and more requested by funders. And I don't think that's always a good thing. I heard a story once about a group of men who were, an organization who was trying to combat violence against women, specifically domestic abuse. And the center was repeatedly asked by its funders, what are you doing to address the root cause beyond, bringing women together and trying to, give them counseling and shelter and helping them stand up for themselves? What are you doing with the men? And so the center pulled together men, and they started a program once a week. The men would come and they would have a group therapy. And this happened for 2 years, and they were so happy. They were immediate impact. We have 15 people coming every week.
Mamie, I'm going to pause you. I'm sorry, I'm going to pause you for just a moment. Your video was cutting for a minute. Can you start the story about the organization that you're addressing? Just back up a little bit.
Sure. We back on? This is okay now?
Yeah, you should be good.
Okay. So the women's shelter was focused on ending domestic violence against women, and funders were asking them, what are they doing to stop the root cause? How are they working with men? So the organization started a group for the men to come once a week and meet with in group therapy, and they ran this program a couple of times, and the funders were asking about immediate impact and said, oh, we have 15 men coming, and they're filling out some surveys, and they're saying, that this is helping, etc. And then after a couple of years, they said, okay, so what's the bigger impact happening? And what they found was actually domestic violence in this community had gone up. And it was shocking because all of the feedback that the organization had been getting was showing positive, quote, immediate impact. But the long-term impact was actually negative, that now these men had more buddies who were in the same community as they were, and were now able to go out drinking with these gentlemen and go home and beat their wives. And this was really shocking when I heard the story, because it made me completely rethink what I ask for and what metrics are really important. So what I now believe is that sometimes these short-term impacts our short-term measures are much less important than the long-term, and that really we're looking for indicators. What are the indicators in the short term that we're making progress towards that long-term impact? Not what's the immediate impact, but what are those indicators? And again, it's a slight shift in how a funder thinks. But if an organization can identify the indicators and present to the funder, this is what we're measuring because we have a theory that says, if this is happening, then X, Y, and Z will happen 3, 4, 5, 10 years out from now. Then I, as a funder, can think about, are those the right indicators? Do I believe in this story they're telling me? Do I believe in this theory that they have about how their programming creates this kind of change? Then I can decide if I agree, and if I do, it gives me faith that the organization is doing the right work.
Great. I mean, very well said. I think that what I'd point out from my side of things is there's a big difference with organizations that are established, that are emerging, and those that have really gotten their feet wet but aren't maybe name brand yet. So my organization is an old organization. It's 76 years old. It's no argument what our impact is. The discussion is, are we still relevant as a catalyst for the arts? For an organization that's 2 years old you're looking at, they might have predictions, but they might not have enough experience yet. So it doesn't make them less valuable, but how can you believe them if they're embarking on a need that hasn't been proven it can be met yet? What do you look at for something that's a fledgling organization that might address something important but doesn't have the backing yet, doesn't have the history?
Well, I don't know that it's all that different than the situation that you're in, saying, are we still relevant? I mean, I think in both cases, the idea of what is the need or what is the problem that this organization is designed to solve is the same. And then what is the organization doing to try and solve this problem? Or if they have to validate the problem, what hypotheses do they have and how are they going to test it and validate it? It doesn't seem like it's really all that different.
Okay.
And even an organization that is really established and has a proven need, it still comes down to what is your theory of change? How are you saying that you're going to create this positive change that you seek to have in the world. And then as a funder, do I agree or disagree? And if I disagree, let's have a conversation about it. So I'm curious how you position this. What do you describe as the need, or and how do you show those indicators of success?
So in specific for AICF, we have an independent program, an audition process that takes 7 months, that recognizes the top artists in all the fields of the arts in Israel. But as I said, these are artists usually 5 to sometimes 20 years before they become famous. So the challenge is not that we're not relevant because we've funded 18,000 artists, of which they're almost every famous Israeli on the planet in the arts. The challenge I have with funders is convincing that that need is still relevant. It was easier with my predecessors when Israel was a fledgling country. Now it's a wealthy country compared to where it was. There are more millionaires, there's more of a population, so how much of the need is dependent on international support compared to Israeli? So that's where what we have to show is that the challenges for raising money in the arts in Israel are just as challenging and dire as they were 10 years ago and 30 years ago, because in the world of arts and culture, we're one of the smallest pieces of the philanthropic pie. If we were focused on security or disabilities or other incredible needs, we would have an easier time, because in the end, music lessons versus security, it's always going to be security. So we really have to look at the bigger picture of how we fit into the larger context of Israel's branding and its image, because we believe arts and culture is one of the most relevant vehicles for it. But if I was having a conversation with a funder and I couldn't articulate that in that concise a manner, I probably lost my opportunity to convince them that 12-year-old piano lessons and funding a 24-year-old painter is as important if they feel the arts have value. So the rarity of getting to that point in a conversation is in itself the hardest part. Because as I said, of our 700 funders, I am active and engaged with a lot of them. But there are many, even in our somewhat significant pool, that don't necessarily want to engage. They want us part of their portfolio, and we're grateful and they're gracious, and year to year it continues. It's a much rarer thing to have a philanthropist engage with us whom I haven't convinced to join our board.
That's the whole idea of engaging when you're not on a board is a relatively new thing for me, I'll say, because for much of my philanthropic life, people reach out to me as a member of my family's foundation, and it's only been more recently that people have started to reach out because of individual gifts that my husband and I are making. And at first I was very much like, I don't want to have these conversations. I know they're just going to ask me for more money. But the truth is that's not actually what happens. And I give executive directors a lot of credit for reaching out to people and saying, I actually do just want to have a conversation. I'm not trying to pitch you. I'm curious. Why is it that you're giving to us? And what is it that inspires you? And what do you see in the world that you think we should know about? And I've found that these conversations have been really eye-opening for me, because I'm learning more about an organization. I get to know their leadership, which is much more than what I read online. And in half an hour, I feel like I've built a whole new pathway towards a future with this organization. Now, I also understand that that's a lot of time. If every professional is having half-hour conversations with every donor, that's a lot of their time. And that might not be right for everyone, but I'm curious what your experience has been in terms of reaching out to people like that.
I try to have, to be honest, and it's a huge number, at least 400 to 500 conversations a year with new people, not just for fundraising, but really to engage with what we're relevant in and how to build our network greater and greater. And as I said, the doors that a philanthropist can open to others are really the best doors to walk through, because you come with the street cred and the belief that if somebody that they know took the time to introduce you, you're worth sitting down with. Because I would say that there's not a single philanthropist alive who isn't asked for money every day, if not 10 times a day. And I think one of the challenging things is not saying no, but understanding when you want to say yes, what has to go in order to do that. because there is a limit for what philanthropy can be. And I would say that every very affluent person I know could give more than they do, with a few exceptions. But even that, if you're a substantial philanthropist within your means, it does have its limits. What I think is the most disconcerting part is not that I have these conversations and that they help my organization, but I spend a considerable amount of time making funders aware that they're funding the same things. Because I look at it, organizations, I could tell you an enormous amount about the world of arts and culture because we exist as a funder of it. And when I have those conversations with philanthropists who are active arts and culture philanthropists, they open my eyes to other perspectives, things I didn't know. So there's a lot that I think could happen on your side, on the philanthropist, the funder side, because essentially what you and your husband or you and your family are funding creates a map for where you overlap with other funders. And if you were aware of every funder that hit the same parallels and everyone was in the conversation, I think a lot of NGOs would be in a stronger point because you might identify through your own networking 6 organizations that also need to help with activities in Ohio where your family has its presence. Mm-hmm. And maybe you're not aware of it because they're not based in Ohio. They're based in, Chicago, and therefore, even though it's not that far, you don't run in the exact same circles. So I think that there's a lot that needs to happen on both sides for where peers work as peers, not as rivals, either as funders or as nonprofits. Because only when you're in that conversation do you find out what's really driving either the funder or the NGO for what they need.
Very well said, David.
I just want to interject for just a moment and remind anyone who's listening in, we've got 8 or so minutes left to finish up this very meaty conversation. So I'm seeing some things happen on Twitter. If you have questions that you want to shoot in through the Hangout itself or on Twitter using hashtag ELI Talks, please do that, and we will get to them in these last couple of minutes.
And we'll answer any question except for what we personally feel about Netanyahu speaking before Congress. Off the table, although I've been asked every day.
Exactly.
Mamie, I want to go back to, I think, a big part of the catalyst for your talk, which is not just that this is important to do and it should happen, but what do we do to make this happen? It's well and good that we agree there needs to be a change, but how does it happen? Nonprofits can't simply come and just expose all their vulnerabilities and say we need to have conversations, and funders don't want to say we'll fund everything that is open and honest we can relate to. So how does this shift? How do you have to call other philanthropists and get them into this methodology? Do you have to have organizations as shining examples of where this works? What changes this paradigm to actually go from rhetoric to action?
Well, there's a lot that has to happen. And I think the first part of this is sharing my ELI talk with as many people as possible. Part of the reason why I decided to do an ELI talk was because this was something that I've been thinking about for a number of years and trying to do my own philanthropy, and have just been continually disappointed that others aren't acting in a similar manner. And so this was a chance to try and broadcast this message to more people to say, hey, reconsider how you do your philanthropy. So I think it's wonderful if everyone can share this with their boards and with their funders in a way to say, we're interested in what Mamie has to say, not because it's Mamie, but because the message is something that's different from what we've heard in the past about how philanthropists and how nonprofit professionals can engage. So the first is use this as a catalyst to get the conversation started.
So from my side, forget myself or AICF. What do I need to tell you as a grantee or a potential grantee to engage you in a conversation properly? Let's say you're not the one that's trying to start this movement with a few other philanthropists. What do you think will be receptive for an NGO to actually say that doesn't undermine them or doesn't alienate the funder?
Well, I think it's complicated because I'm sure there are a group of funders who are really not interested in engaging these kind of conversations, who are going to be less receptive to hearing about some of the inside challenges. And so, understanding who of your current philanthropy base, who of your current funders are likely to embrace this kind of new relationship, and separate those from the people who either you don't need to spend the time with because you just don't feel like they're really ever going to be that interested in engaging, or because you don't think they're likely to want to engage in this kind of style. It's just not the way that they think or the way that they work. And start with the people who you think are kind of the low-hanging fruit that would be interested. And then I would reach out to them, again, send them the ELI talk so that they have some context, but also start by saying, we would really like to have a conversation with you about what's going on, and here's some great things that are going on, and here's some challenges. And start by being a little bit vulnerable. You don't have to show everything and make the situation so dire, but I'm always skeptical when an organization says, everything is fantastic, all we need is money. I'm like, that can't be true, because I run a business and I know that everything is never all fantastic and it's never just about money, that there's always something else going on. So what is something that you can share to say, this is something that we're struggling with and I'd love to hear some advice from you. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, and I'd love to just get the conversation going.
And not with an ask for hiring a new development person or a strategic consultant, but simply asking to have the conversation, asking for advice, correct?
Exactly. And I was given that.
You're not tying it to, Mamie, I'd really like to have this talk. $50,000 is going to make sure we make this work. But simply, I know you're engaged as a funder. I know that you've done this talk and we're spreading it everywhere, and you fund my organization in Ohio, and I want to see what I can do to take this to the next level. Here's what I'm facing. And I don't have a solution for all of it, but I have a solution for part of it, and this is what we started with. Something like that?
Yes, I was given advice when I was starting my business that if you ask for money, you'll get advice, and if you ask for advice, you'll get money. And I haven't gotten far enough along to know if it's really true.
It is absolutely true beyond all belief. There's nothing else but it.
Yes, and so I think that's a great way to engage with funders.
That sounds like an excellent place to close up our conversation.
So,
maybe that'll be our final takeaway for our conversation today. Any other last nuggets that either of you would like to share before we close up?
I mean, now that Mamie's put it out there, I'm just going to say, Mamie, I'd really like your advice sometime.
David, I am happy to give it to you.
Fantastic. Miriam, thank you for having us for part of this. And Mamie, thank you for including me as the talk from your talk. It was my pleasure to join you both with this today.
Great. Thank you, Miriam, as well. This has been such a pleasure, David.
Thank you both.
David, I always love having these conversations, and I look forward to many more.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you both for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, your time, all of these things. Thank you to everyone who watched and who tweeted, and I apologize if we didn't get to your questions, but both Mamie and David are online and ready to continue the conversation on Twitter, #EliTalks, or you can send some follow-up questions to the Facebook event and all of these things, and we'll be happy to keep the conversation going. Check out Mamie's talk, Teaching an Organization to Fish. Use it as a conversation starter with your board and your funders. And we'll get this movement going. I would also encourage everyone to check out a lot of this conversation. I think relates to another talk that we filmed as part of this series by Lisa Lepson, who talked about dreams, risk, patience as the recipe for Jewish philanthropy. And I think there's a lot of insights from her talk that relate to this conversation as well. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Thank you again. We'll be back with more ELI on Air. Stay tuned to ELI Talks. Check out the America Israel Cultural Foundation and Starling. And we will look forward to seeing you again next time. So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.